The fluorescent lights of JFK Terminal 4 buzzed overhead as Sarah Martinez clutched her boarding pass, her hands trembling slightly from the day's events. The coffee shop's aroma mixed with the distant hum of jet engines, creating a symphony of departure that matched her shattered career expectations. Her reflection in the terminal's glass windows showed a woman who had given everything to Meridian Corp, only to be discarded like yesterday's quarterly reports. The announcement for Flight 1247 to Chicago echoed through the concourse, but Sarah's mind was still trapped in that sterile conference room where her 15-year career had ended with a manila folder and a security escort. She had built the Tokyo partnership from scratch, navigating cultural nuances and language barriers that had stumped seasoned executives for years. Now, walking toward Gate B12, she wondered if any of it had mattered at all. The boarding gate was a study in controlled chaos, with business travelers typing frantically on laptops, while families juggled carry-on bags and restless children. Sarah found a corner seat near the window, watching the planes taxi across the tarmac under the gray November sky that seemed to mirror her mood perfectly. Her phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, their sympathy mixed with relief that it wasn't them facing unemployment at 42. The severance package sat in her briefcase like a consolation prize, enough to survive a few months, but not nearly enough to rebuild what she'd lost. She thought about her apartment in Chicago, empty except for takeout containers and the ghosts of a social life she'd sacrificed for corporate success. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the boarding process would begin shortly for passengers traveling to Chicago O'Hare. Sarah's mind drifted to the Tokyo office, where she'd spent countless late nights perfecting presentations and building relationships that had taken years to cultivate. The cultural intricacies of Japanese business had become second nature to her, from the proper bow depths to the subtle art of reading between the lines during negotiations. She remembered her first successful deal, when Tanaka-san had finally agreed to the partnership after months of careful relationship building and cultural sensitivity training. The memory felt distant now, like watching someone else's life through frosted glass, beautiful but untouchable. Her phone screen showed 17 missed calls from various departments, probably vultures circling to claim pieces of her projects. The boarding announcement interrupted her thoughts, calling for first-class passengers and frequent flyers to begin the boarding process. The line moved slowly, giving Sarah time to process the magnitude of her situation as she shuffled forward with her fellow travelers. Her career had been her identity for so long that she struggled to imagine who she was without the business cards and corner office views. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass with practiced efficiency, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes before waving Sarah through. As she walked down the jet bridge, the November wind whistled through the gaps in the accordion-style walkway, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and impending winter. The flight attendant's greeting was warm but generic, the kind of professional courtesy that reminded Sarah of her own interactions with clients over the years. She found her seat in row 23, middle seat between a sleeping businessman and a woman frantically texting on her phone. The overhead compartments were already packed, forcing Sarah to wedge her carry-on into a space 3 rows back, another small indignity in a day full of them. The plane pushed back from the gate with mechanical precision, and Sarah watched through the small window as JFK grew smaller beneath them. The patchwork of Queens neighborhoods spread out below, each light representing someone's life, someone's dreams, someone's struggles that made her own seem less catastrophic by comparison. The businessman beside her stirred slightly, adjusting his tie even in sleep, a gesture so familiar it made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition. She had been that person, living for the next deal, the next promotion, the next validation from superiors who ultimately saw her as expendable. The plane banked left, revealing the Manhattan skyline in the distance, its towers gleaming in the afternoon sun like monuments to ambition. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring, but the future felt as cloudy as the sky outside her window. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, announcing they had reached cruising altitude and were free to move about the cabin. Sarah's phone buzzed in her purse, but she ignored it, assuming it was another sympathy message from a colleague who would probably forget her name within a month. The vibration continued, insistent and rhythmic, like a heartbeat that refused to be ignored, despite her desire to disconnect from everything related to Meridian Corp. She finally retrieved the device, squinting at the screen to read the incoming call notification that made her heart skip a beat. The number was international, with a country code she recognized immediately from months of late-night conference calls and early morning strategy sessions. Her thumb hovered over the accept button, torn between the desire to ignore anything work-related and the curiosity that had driven her success for 15 years. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing her to grip the armrest as the aircraft shuddered slightly, a physical reminder of the instability that had become her new normal. She answered the call just as the businessman beside her opened his eyes, annoyed by the sudden movement and the sound of her voice cutting through the cabin's white noise. The voice on the other end was unmistakably that of Hiroshi Tanaka, the director of international partnerships at Meridian's Tokyo headquarters, speaking with the crisp formality that had initially intimidated Sarah years ago. His English was precise, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the weight of someone who never made casual phone calls during business hours. The connection crackled slightly, the satellite delay creating an awkward rhythm that made Sarah acutely aware of the distance between her current reality and her former professional life. "Sarah-san, I hope I am not disturbing you, but there has been a development regarding your departure that requires immediate discussion," he said, his tone carrying an urgency that made her stomach tighten. The businessman beside her was now fully awake, pretending to read his magazine while clearly eavesdropping on her conversation. Sarah lowered her voice, acutely aware that 30,000 feet above the ground was not the ideal place for sensitive corporate conversations. "The Yoshida Industries partnership has encountered unexpected complications following the announcement of your termination," Tanaka continued, his formal language barely masking what Sarah recognized as carefully controlled panic. She had worked with him long enough to read between the lines of his diplomatic phrasing, understanding that unexpected complications translated to complete disaster in corporate speak. The deal she had structured was worth $47 million over 3 years, representing not just revenue but credibility in the Asian market that Meridian desperately needed. Through the airplane window, she could see the geometric patterns of farmland passing below, each field a reminder of the methodical approach she had taken to building this partnership from the ground up. Her pulse quickened as she realized that her dismissal might have been more impactful than anyone had anticipated, including herself. The flight attendant passed by with the drink cart, the familiar ritual of in-flight service continuing, despite the fact that Sarah's world was potentially shifting beneath her feet. "Yoshida-san has expressed serious concerns about Meridian's commitment to the partnership without your continued involvement," Tanaka explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering news that could reshape corporate strategy. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and dread, knowing that her expertise had been validated even as she grappled with the implications of this revelation. The partnership had been built on personal relationships and cultural understanding that couldn't be transferred through email or replaced by another executive with an MBA and good intentions. She had spent 18 months learning the subtleties of Japanese business culture, from the importance of consensus building to the art of saving face during difficult negotiations. The businessman beside her had given up all pretense of reading and was now openly listening, his curiosity apparently stronger than his sense of propriety. Sarah turned toward the window, seeking what little privacy was available in the confined space of the aircraft cabin. "What exactly are you telling me, Tanaka-san?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling through her mind like the clouds outside her window. The formal address felt natural after years of working together, but it also reminded her of the professional distance that had always existed between them, despite their successful collaboration. His response came after a pause that lasted long enough for Sarah to wonder if the connection had been lost, the satellite delay making every second feel like an eternity. "Yoshida-san has indicated that they will withdraw from the partnership unless you return to your position as lead negotiator," he said, his words landing with the impact of a corporate earthquake. Sarah gripped her phone tighter, acutely aware that the conversation was being conducted in front of dozens of strangers who had no idea they were witnessing what might be a pivotal moment in her career. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was receiving potentially life-changing news while trapped in a metal tube hurtling through the sky at 500 miles per hour. The implications of Tanaka's words began to sink in as Sarah processed the magnitude of what he was telling her. Yoshida Industries wasn't just another client. They were the cornerstone of Meridian's Asian expansion strategy, with connections throughout the region that could open doors to opportunities worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Her dismissal had been presented as a cost-cutting measure, but the reality was that removing her from the equation had potentially cost the company far more than her salary and benefits ever would. The woman on her right was now texting furiously, probably sharing gossip about the dramatic phone call she was witnessing, while the businessman had completely abandoned his magazine in favor of the real-life corporate drama unfolding beside him. Sarah realized that her departure had created a domino effect that whoever made the decision to terminate her had clearly not anticipated. The plane's engines hummed steadily, providing a constant backdrop to a conversation that might determine whether her career was truly over or just beginning a new chapter. "There's more," Tanaka continued, his voice taking on an even more serious tone that made Sarah's heart race despite her efforts to remain calm. The flight attendant appeared at her elbow, offering drinks with a professional smile that reminded Sarah of her own ability to maintain composure under pressure. She declined with a polite shake of her head, not trusting herself to multitask while processing information that could reshape her entire future. "The CEO has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning Tokyo time to discuss the partnership situation," Tanaka said, his words carefully measured as if he were reading from a script. Sarah glanced at her watch, calculating time zones, and realizing that the meeting would take place while she was probably still processing the events of the day from her apartment in Chicago. The weight of 15 years of career building hung in the balance, dependent on decisions being made in a conference room halfway around the world, by people who might not fully understand the complexity of what they had set in motion. The turbulence hit just as Tanaka delivered the news that would change everything, causing Sarah to grip her phone tighter as the plane shuddered through a pocket of unstable air. "The board has been informed that without your return, Meridian stands to lose not only the Yoshida partnership, but potentially 3 other Japanese companies that were considering similar agreements," he said, his formal tone unable to mask the gravity of the situation. Sarah's mind raced through the implications, calculating the financial impact of losing multiple partnerships that represented years of relationship building and cultural bridge construction. The businessman beside her was now completely invested in her conversation, his magazine forgotten as he listened to what was clearly a high-stakes corporate drama playing out in real time. Through the window, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, a visual metaphor for the chaos that her dismissal had apparently unleashed within the company she had served faithfully for 15 years. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, asking passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts due to expected turbulence ahead. "Sarah-san, I must ask you directly," Tanaka continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who rarely made personal appeals. "Would you consider returning to your position if the board were to reverse their decision?" The question hung in the air like the tension before a thunderstorm, loaded with possibilities that Sarah had not dared to consider just hours earlier. Her initial reaction was a mixture of vindication and anger, emotions that warred with the practical considerations of her financial situation and career prospects. The severance package that had seemed like a lifeline earlier now felt like a consolation prize compared to the leverage she suddenly held over the company that had discarded her so callously. She thought about the executives who had made the decision to terminate her, probably sitting in their offices right now dealing with the consequences of their short-sighted cost-cutting measures. The plane bounced again, reminding her that she was quite literally caught between her past and her future, suspended in air while her career hung in the balance. "I need to understand something first," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she processed the magnitude of the situation. "How did my dismissal happen if the partnerships were so dependent on my involvement?" The question revealed the heart of her confusion and anger, the sense that she had been blindsided by a decision that seemed to contradict everything she knew about her value to the company. Tanaka's pause was longer this time, filled with the kind of diplomatic silence that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. "The decision was made by the domestic operations team without full consultation with international partnerships," he finally admitted, his formal language barely concealing what Sarah recognized as a massive communication failure within the company's management structure. The woman beside her was now openly staring, her texting forgotten as she watched Sarah navigate what was clearly a pivotal moment in her professional life. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the bureaucratic incompetence that had led to her dismissal, followed immediately by a cold satisfaction at the chaos it had apparently created. The plane's captain announced that they were beginning their descent into Chicago, the familiar ritual of landing preparations providing a stark contrast to the life-changing conversation taking place in seat 23B. Sarah realized that she had approximately 20 minutes to make decisions that would determine the trajectory of her career and possibly her entire future. "Tanaka-san, I appreciate your call, but I need to think about this," she said, her mind already working through the implications of returning to a company that had shown such poor judgment in letting her go. The businessman beside her was now making no effort to hide his interest. His head turned toward her as if watching a particularly engaging television drama. "I understand, Sarah-san, but I must tell you that the board meeting is in 14 hours, and they will need an answer before then," Tanaka replied, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that corporate decisions wait for no one. The descent was becoming more noticeable now, her ears popping as the aircraft began its approach to O'Hare International Airport. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and she glanced at the screen to see a notification from her direct supervisor, or rather, her former direct supervisor. The message was short and to the point. "Need to talk urgently. Are you available?" The irony of receiving multiple communications from a company that had escorted her out of the building just hours earlier was not lost on her. She showed the message to no one, but the businessman beside her craned his neck enough to catch a glimpse of her screen before she turned it away. "Tanaka-san, I'm receiving calls from other people at the company now," she said, her voice taking on a note of wry amusement at the sudden attention from colleagues who had seemed perfectly content to let her go earlier. "Yes, I believe several departments are now aware of the situation," he replied diplomatically, his understatement suggesting that the news of the partnership crisis had spread through the company like wildfire. The plane's landing gear deployed with a mechanical thunk, signaling that her flight was nearly over, but her professional journey was potentially just beginning a new chapter. "I want you to know, Sarah-san, that I argued against your dismissal when I heard about it," Tanaka said, his formal facade cracking slightly to reveal genuine concern. "But I was told it was a final decision from executive leadership." His admission provided context that Sarah had been lacking, explaining why her termination had felt so abrupt and disconnected from her performance reviews and recent successes. The revelation that international partnerships had not been consulted about her dismissal painted a picture of corporate dysfunction that was both frustrating and, in a twisted way, validating. She had spent years building bridges between cultures and departments, only to be undone by the very communication failures she had worked to prevent. The city of Chicago was now visible below them, its skyline familiar and welcoming after the emotional turbulence of the day. Sarah realized that she was returning to a city that represented both her past and potentially her future, depending on the decisions she made in the next few hours. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and the familiar sounds of landing, the reverse thrust of engines, the squeal of brakes, the collective sigh of passengers, provided a soundtrack to one of the most surreal days of her professional life. The terminal at O'Hare buzzed with the familiar chaos of evening arrivals, but Sarah moved through it like someone in a trance, her mind still processing the conversation that had transformed her day from disaster to opportunity. Her phone had been ringing constantly since she'd ended the call with Tanaka, displaying names she recognized from various departments within Meridian Corp., each call representing another person who suddenly needed her expertise urgently. The November air outside the terminal was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of impending winter that Chicago wore like a familiar coat. But Sarah barely noticed as she climbed into the taxi that would take her back to her apartment. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and an Ethiopian accent, tried to make conversation about the weather, but Sarah was too preoccupied to engage beyond polite monosyllables. Through the taxi's window, she watched the city pass by, the same buildings, the same streets, the same life she had left that morning. But everything felt different now because she was different. The realization that she held more power than she had ever imagined was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her apartment welcomed her with the silence of a space that had been abandoned in haste, the morning's coffee cup still sitting on the counter next to the newspaper she had abandoned when the call came summoning her to the termination meeting. The familiar surroundings felt strange now, as if she were viewing her life through a different lens, one that showed her the possibilities she had never considered before. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was her former supervisor, David Chen, whose message was more desperate than the others. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately. The CEO wants to schedule a call with you tonight." She set the phone down and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon like a constellation of human ambition and dreams. The view was the same one she had looked at every day for 5 years, but tonight it seemed to hold different possibilities, different futures that branched out like the network of streets below. She had spent so many nights at this window, planning strategies and rehearsing presentations, never imagining that her expertise would become so valuable that its absence could threaten multi-million-dollar partnerships. The callback from CEO Michael Rodriguez came at exactly 9 p.m., his voice carrying the kind of carefully controlled urgency that Sarah had learned to recognize in high-stakes business situations. "Sarah, I want to personally apologize for the miscommunication that led to your dismissal," he began, his words carefully crafted to acknowledge fault without accepting full responsibility. She could hear the strain in his voice, the weight of someone who had spent the day dealing with the consequences of a decision that had seemed simple in the morning, but had become catastrophically complex by evening. The formality of their conversation was underscored by the fact that this was the first time the CEO had ever called her directly, despite her 15 years with the company and her role in securing some of their most important international partnerships. "I understand there have been some developments with our Japanese partners," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that she felt like an actor who had suddenly been given a completely different script in the middle of a performance. "The board has asked me to extend an offer for you to return to your position, with a significant increase in compensation and expanded responsibilities," Rodriguez continued, his words carrying the weight of someone who was clearly operating under pressure from multiple directions. Sarah listened to the details of the offer: a 30% salary increase, additional vacation time, and a new title that would give her more authority over international partnerships. All benefits that would have seemed impossible just that morning. The irony was not lost on her that she was receiving the promotion she had been seeking for 2 years, but only because her absence had created chaos within the company. She thought about the executives who had made the decision to terminate her, wondering if they were part of this conversation, or if they were dealing with their own professional consequences. The city lights outside her window seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat as she processed the magnitude of what was being offered to her. "I need to think about this overnight," she said, her voice carrying a confidence she hadn't felt since walking into that termination meeting. The next morning brought news that would validate every difficult decision Sarah had made in her career, arriving in the form of a conference call with the Tokyo office that included not just Tanaka, but also representatives from 3 other Japanese companies that had been considering partnerships with Meridian. Yoshida-san himself joined the call, his gravelly voice carrying the authority of someone who had built his company from the ground up and understood the value of personal relationships in business. "Sarah-san," he said, his English careful but clear, "we have worked together for many months to build something important. Your departure makes us question Meridian's commitment to our partnership and to understanding our way of doing business." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, touching on the cultural sensitivity and long-term thinking that had made their partnership successful. Sarah realized that she wasn't just negotiating for her own return. She was potentially determining the future of Meridian's expansion into the Asian market, a market that could represent hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over the next decade. The final piece of the puzzle came when Sarah learned that her dismissal had been part of a broader cost-cutting initiative that had been implemented without input from the international division, a decision that revealed the kind of strategic short-sightedness that could cripple a company's long-term growth. As she sat in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her interrupted morning and the possibilities of her uncertain future, Sarah understood that she had been given something more valuable than job security. She had been given leverage. The phone calls continued throughout the day, each one adding another layer to her understanding of how her expertise had been woven into the fabric of the company's international operations, in ways that even she hadn't fully appreciated. The woman who had boarded Flight 1247 as a discarded employee was now in a position to dictate terms to the company that had dismissed her, armed with the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful position is the one you don't realize you hold until someone tries to take it away from you. As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reflected off the windows of the corporate towers downtown, Sarah made her decision. She would return to Meridian Corp, but not as the same person who had left. The experience had taught her that her value was not determined by the opinions of executives who didn't understand the complexity of her work, but by the tangible results she had achieved and the relationships she had built. The next morning, she would walk back into the building that had ejected her, carrying with her the power that comes from being irreplaceable in a world that often treats everyone as expendable. The city lights twinkled below her window like stars, each one representing a dream, a struggle, or a triumph. And Sarah understood that her own light was about to shine brighter than ever before.